Before we start off, I'd like to introduce our speaker and tell you a little bit about the Hunt Institute. On that, our today's speaker is Patrick Schaefer. He is the executive director for the Hunt Institute for Global Competitiveness here at UTEP. And so the Institute looks at projects within the region that had some kind of economic impact. On that, in most cases, people think of simply monetary things on the deal, but things that are very interesting, things like energy resources, things that have an impact on the economy. On that, so they're looking at energy resources, they're looking at trade and travel, things of that nature. But as Patrick and I spoke beforehand, it could be really a widget. It's whatever affects the market, and that's what they're looking at, market forces. On that, which makes this symposium very interesting, because there is an interest, right? Most of you are in law enforcement, some are in banking. The folks in law enforcement, the investigators, how often are you told to follow the money? See that in news, follow the money, right? And that's easier said than done, especially when you don't understand the process and the system, not only in the U.S. and in Mexico. And so what we hope to, from this symposium is to provide you some insight where to begin with that process. And the symposium actually shouldn't be the end, hopefully the end of your interaction with the Hunt Institute. On that, you'll see from our website, it'll have their contact information. It'll have Mr. Schaefer's contact information as well as the Hunt Institute. And I would encourage you, after this, if you find this of an interest, to contact them. On that, I've had the opportunity to introduce them to folks from the West Texas HIDA. I'll talk a little about that. We're going to continue to do that with other entities. And so this is a resource of yours at your hometown university. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of that. On that, before Patrick comes up, and I speak a little bit of Patrick's background, I'd like to introduce Myra Maldonado. Myra, can you just stand up a little bit slow? Thank you, Myra. Myra is the Associate Director of the Hunt Institute. On that, and between her and Patrick, on that, they are this team that has founded and has made the Hunt Institute roll forward and move forward on that. And so when you speak to Patrick, you're speaking to Myra. If you're speaking to Myra, you're speaking to Patrick. So during that break, if Patrick's tied up with people asking questions, by all means, come and speak to Myra, and she'll be able to provide as much information as possible, or at least point you back to Patrick, right? On that. So, but I would encourage you to do that. Just to give you a little bit of background on Patrick, I know it is in your Meet the Research packet, but the one position I would really like to point out is this position held with the World Bank Group and the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. And that position becomes really key into who Patrick Schaefer is and what he does here at the Hunt Institute. It provides that rich contextual understanding of not just a local area, but more of a global area. And I think that will become very beneficial to you as you hear this and say, how is this relevant to what I do every day? And so the idea is it'll provide that contextual information. It's okay, I'll start global, start to narrow it down. He goes, how do I do that if I'm a El Paso County Sheriff's Deputy and I see something out there on that? And it's, how can this be of value to something else? And so with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Patrick Schaefer. Patrick.
What's that? Okay.
I'll help you. Yeah, I'll help you with that. That's the mic.
Okay.
And then,
Controller.
yeah,
Can we get HBO?
okay. Not yet. Not
Okay.
yet.
Good morning, everybody. My first words to you are ones of thanks for making it out today. It's very inclement weather, very cold, and I really would like to express the thanks of the university, of the president, and Vic for all of you taking the time to come here. I would also like to start by just saying a few words about the Hunt Institute, also as a way of expressing our thanks. The Hunt Institute is a unique resource on the U.S.-Mexico border. It has a model and a platform that doesn't exist in San Diego or the Lower Rio Grande Valley, Albuquerque, even Washington, D.C., or Mexico City. And why is it unique? It's unique because it's a combination both of regulatory research in the U.S.-Mexico border between Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, but it's also a quantitative and economic research platform. So we're able to combine perspectives of not only the regulatory and the legal structures that govern our region, but also how that happens across the borders of this binational gateway. We, as Vic said, have a broad mandate, and we look at the regional markets that converge here, whether that's energy, whether that's water, education, banking and finance, et cetera. And as we'll see later, there's a lot of market convergence here, but then at the same time, there's a lot of market divergence. And all of you in law enforcement know very well that, and even in the private sector, know that divergence creates a lot of black boxes. We simply don't always understand what's happening on the other side of a border or within another jurisdiction. Even within the law enforcement divisions in the United States, I think a lot of times there's opportunity to have better resource and information sharing. So the whole genesis of this project came about because, as I was saying, we try to strengthen the region's social and economic development by explaining the markets that converge here. And we wanted to focus on key sectors. The one we did last year was energy, looking at hydrocarbons, looking at renewable energy resources, the electricity sector. And then as we transitioned into 2017, we set our focus on the banking and finance structures that are active here. At that time, we received a call from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City asking if we'd be interested in extending this research to include money laundering and national security and public safety questions. And we eagerly took up that opportunity because, as Vic also was saying, the Hunt Institute is a resource for all of you. I know that even in our institute, resources are scarce, time is scarce, there's a lot on our plates. So to the extent that we're able to help you with research questions, to help you understand these neighboring markets or these activities that are active in the region, that's really what we're here for. That's our primary mission. And the other thing I just want to mention that's special about the Institute is that it's driven by UTEP students. Many of you are probably UTEP graduates, and it's very heartening to see that our university and our community is working to understand our region, and not only understand our region as a region, but explain that region to Mexico City, to Washington, to Austin, and to Santa Fe and Chihuahua City. So without much more ado, I'd like to get into the subject matter of today's presentation, which is about banking, finance, and national security in this Paso del Norte region. And the first thing that I wanted to focus on was this image of a map that was created in 1853, right after the U.S.-Mexico War. And this map will be coming back into our thoughts as we go through the presentation, and probably even as you continue in your work, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, dealing with binational relations or public safety issues. So this map, also interesting to note, was published in New York, not here in the region. And this area is what came to be known as the Gaston Purchase. And the Gaston Purchase was this strip of land that was of vital economic and national strategic interest to the United States after the U.S.-Mexico War. This is the gateway currently that hosts the Union Pacific Railroad out to Long Beach and Los Angeles and I-10. It's also the road that hosted the Butterfield Stagecoach Trail. None of us are old enough to remember that, before the railroads. And after the U.S.-Mexico War, this area became disputed because the United States and Mexico were relying on old maps. So they had to send out these surveyors to create a new boundary. In fact, if you go to Mesilla today, you'll see that in the plaza, it says 1853, and that in Mexico is known as La Pérdida de Mesilla, and in the United States is known as the Gaston Purchase. So anyway, this is really to set in our minds as we go through this presentation that across all kinds of sectors and all kinds of activities, this region has been and remains a disputed territory that creates a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulties for our families, for our communities, for our businesses, and even for our law enforcement agencies. So the other thing to remember about our region and why this disputed territory is so important is because of our geographic isolation. That little dot there, the white dot, that's White Sands, and we're just to the southeast of that. Now, if you look at that continent, there's a lot of water on the east and there's a lot of water on the west, and there's a lot of land in between. And that land in between is dominated by the Rocky Mountain chains. So when you're a truck driver, when you're a train engineer, when you're not just even a train engineer, when you're trying to build a road or build a railroad, you have to think about how I'm going to get that stuff from one side to the other, from one market to the other. And there's only a few very efficient or feasible overland trade routes through the Rocky Mountains. And one here is through El Paso, the 32nd parallel, and the other is through Albuquerque on the 35th parallel. There's a couple other passages to the north, but they're not all weather. They're very tricky. I mean, I don't know, any of you have tried to go through the Rockies west of Denver, but it's quite treacherous. So we're blessed with this geostrategic trade route, but it's also a challenge for us, as many of us know who deal with, for example, drug trafficking operations or human trafficking or migratory issues. And the other thing that is important to remember about our region is not just an east-west gateway, it's also a north-south gateway. So hundreds and hundreds of years ago, even thousands of years ago, this trade route started to develop between northern New Mexico and the Front Range of the Rockies and central Mexico. And then in the Spanish Empire, that came to be known as the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And now it's I-25 and Mexico 45. And so we're, again, blessed with a geostrategic crossroads, not just a east-west gateway, but a north-south gateway. But we're also, in some ways, challenged by that. And the Hunt Institute is working, as I said earlier, to share with everybody in our community what's happening on the other sides of those trade routes that is important to us, but that we might not know about. This trade route, as I showed you, has to go through this very rocky and mountainous and foreboding landscape. So that means that this gateway, this river valley, became really contested between different countries and different states. Texas went to war against Mexico and it claimed land all the way up to Albuquerque, including El Paso. New Mexico was a holdover from the Spanish Empire. The United States took this land, as I mentioned earlier, in the U.S.-Mexico War. We even still see this contested battleground, not necessarily between state actors, but certainly, as many of you know, between non-state actors and these drug trafficking organizations. This gateway is probably the most strategic gateway on the U.S.-Mexico border because of its access to the Pacific, its access to the Midwest markets, its access to the Gulf markets and the Atlantic. So the presence of these governments also did something else. Everyone in the region likes to do things differently. Texas likes to do things its own way. New Mexico likes to do things its own way, the US and Mexico as well. But there's something important to remember about the way that they do things. And I, as a lawyer, couldn't miss speaking about legal systems with you this morning. So in Mexico, they have a certain legal structure which is different from the US and common law legal system. And the Mexican legal system is one, when you look at market structures or when you look at the way that the economy is governed, is one that's very top-down, you could say. It's one where they are not easily reactive to market innovations or market activity. For example, in Mexico, there's the contract code. So all the types of contracts are stipulated and expressed by the government ahead of time. In the US, in the Texas and New Mexico legal system, our contract law is made between parties as time goes on. So there's no ex-ante determination of what constitutes a valid contract or what constitutes an invalid contract ahead of time. So this kind of market structures between Mexico and the United States and their difference created different economic growth patterns and different economic vitality. Because of the sort of closed and difficult way of contracting is in Mexico, the economy didn't necessarily burgeon or expand as it did in the United States. So the access to capital, the access to markets is much smaller than it is in the United States. Texas and New Mexico and the United States in general have a very active free market where people can enter into contracts really as they feel free. Now, the importance of this is that as history unfolded, the U.S. was able to really take advantage and exploit and leverage markets and create markets all across the United States. So they wanted to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And as I mentioned earlier, there was no better way to get there than through El Paso. And this is a map of the Southern Pacific Railway, which is now Union Pacific. And you'll see that it went through El Paso here and connected in Deming in 1881 and also in Sierra Blanca in 1881 as well to create the second and the third transcontinental routes. And for those of you in law enforcement, you know that those communities are still of great importance for counter criminal operations. So what also happened with this expansion of the railroads and the expansion of the economy because of these legal systems and these legal structures, what you had was a similar interest on the part of Mexico to reach up and engage with the U.S. market. There is no market in the world as dynamic, as voracious, as strong as the U.S. market. So that means that everybody is trying to get their goods or their services into the U.S. market. For those of you who have looked at the U.S.-Mexico border from Tijuana to Matamoros, can see the sort of almost forward operating bases of how the communities have expanded there, whether it's with industrialization, whether it's because they work as migratory magnets. Everybody's trying to get things into the United States. So in the late 19th century, Porfirio Diaz, and we have a street named here for him in El Paso, was very interested in this as well. So he decided to build a railroad along this old trade route, the Camino Real, and this was the Ferrocarril Central de Mexico. Now this joined central Mexico to El Paso really efficiently for the first time. And it was also, this was in 1883. So after that time and around this time, you also had the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, this at that time it was the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, reach down from the Midwest into New Mexico and connect here in El Paso. So this really demonstrates and highlights to us how important this region is as a continental and binational trade route, whether that's for car parts, whether that's for people, whether that's for migrants, whether that's for widgets, narcotics, everything is moving to and from here. Now, at the same time that this was happening, the banking system was starting to develop in this region. Interestingly, the first bank in Chihuahua was Santo Eulalia from 1875, right at the time that all these railroads were converging in our region. And I don't know if you see here at the bottom there, bottom right, there's a picture of the choo-choo train. So its importance in binational commerce really can't be overstated. And then on the top is the cattle of also a traditional economic activity in the state. So what also then happened is you had the creation of a bank here in Ciudad Juarez in 1880, and this was El Banco Minero Chihuahuense. And this was founded by wealthy businessmen in the region to take advantage of the coming commerce that was arriving with these railroads and with the expansion of the West, which was ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, a question of the economic regulatory structures of the United States. In El Paso, we had the First State National Bank. And I don't know if any of you opened an account there when you were younger, but this was El Paso's first bank and has been really instrumental in the economic growth of the region. So what I'm trying to really highlight here is not only the geostrategic importance of our region, but also how the trade and commerce that has come into this geostrategic region has brought with it financing and banking activity since a very, very long time ago. Now, this is a slide of the current banks, the biggest banks in Mexico. So what's interesting to note about the banking structure at a national level in Mexico is that of the top 10 banks, 7 hold 78% of the market share. And there's only 48 banks in Mexico. And of these top banks here, Bancomer, Citibanamex, Inbursa, HSBC, Santander, Banorte, Scotiabank, only one of them is a Mexican bank. So Mexican banking system is heavily dominated by foreign banks, and it's a much smaller market than it is in the United States. So we're going to start seeing a lot of divergences in the market and banking structures, not only in the commercial banking, but also in money services businesses and the regulation of those businesses, and then the anti-money laundering activities of both countries. So the regulators for Mexico is also much more simple than it is for the United States. Your principal banking regulators in Mexico is the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público, is the Banco de México, and the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores. And the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público is a cabinet-level agency in Mexico, and they also are the ones that govern the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores. The Banco de México is it's a central bank, and they're primarily concerned with the monetary policy of Mexico and also maintaining the stability of the peso. But as a central bank, it's also instrumental in monitoring payment systems and making sure that the financial system is operating safely and healthily in Mexico. So I want you to keep this in mind when we start thinking about the US system and how that is regulated. This is the kind of work we do that we'll see throughout the presentation. And I also want to just take a moment here to let you know that, again, the Hunt Institute is absolutely your resource. So if there's any kind of information that you need that we can provide, please let us know. So what we strive to do at the Hunt Institute, whether it's with energy markets, water markets, education, is have a good, harmonized, common frame of reference for what's happening in our region simultaneously. So this is a data detailing the top banking, all actually banking institutions in Ciudad Juarez. Not only the name of the institution, its class, its primary regulator, their deposits, and what market share they have. So we do this kind of thing across Chihuahua, New Mexico, and Texas, because you really can't go anywhere without a map. And so what is special and a value added about the Hunt Institute and UTEP is to provide detailed information about the contours of the landscape in order to provide us with as detailed a battle map as possible. So some things just to note here about the Ciudad Juarez banking institutions is that there's only one type of bank class, and there's only one primary regulator at the national level. And that also, if you look at the deposits, it's highly concentrated as well. And that also by those same banks that I mentioned, mostly those foreign banks. Now, this is just another way of looking at that information. These are the top 5 banks in Ciudad Juarez, Bancomer, Banorte, Banamex, Santander, y Scotiabank. And what we also did was we just did a calculation to demonstrate the kind of market concentration of these top 5 banks. So they possess between them 75% of the deposits in the city. Now, with respect to Mexican cities bordering Texas in real deposits, what I wanted to share with you guys was the dominance of Juarez versus other cities on the Texas-Mexico border. Its next biggest center of deposits is Reynosa in Tamaulipas, which also, as you know, is a flashpoint for a criminal activity on the U.S.-Mexico border. And then we also have here Nuevo Laredo, also much a flashpoint, but has much less deposits, and Matamoros, Tamaulipas. So we chose these cities not only because they're major cities, but because of the strategic importance to you all as law enforcement operators and even private sector actors to understand what's happening.
That's compared to twice compared to people.
We'll get to that in a second. I have a slide on that. So the other thing that we look at here was cash transactions. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but the Mexican government tried to limit cash transactions in dollars several years ago because traffickers were bringing a bunch of money across the border into Mexico and just funneling it into bank accounts. So those restrictions have been relaxed a little, but for companies and businesses, but for individuals, they still remain. And I'll get to the precise restrictions in a second. But this is the other kind of work we do. We try to find out through our relationships with Mexican institutions, through our ability to get this data and these numbers, to what extent cash transactions are happening in the region and what that means. And even what kind of things they're going through. In all of the work and the research and the collaboration that we've done with law enforcement agencies on this question, you all know how important it is to understand not only how commercial banks are working, but sort of money services businesses or alternative financial services. So that industry also exists in Mexico, but is in some ways very little understood by, I think, U.S. regulators or state authorities in the United States. So when we look at this cash transactions in U.S. dollars, we're able to understand not only just what's going through commercial banks, but to what extent foreign exchanges are being used, money changers, brokerage firms, and credit unions. Now, this is a snapshot of the U.S. Major actors in the banking system. And it's also important to remember, both with the U.S. and with Mexico, that we see the dominance of multinational and large corporate banks in the government. Because what's happening, both with respect to law enforcement, with respect to business, is our region is being dominated by external actors, whether they're external corporations or external governments. And in many ways, we're here left to kind of pick up the pieces and try to put things back together that these decisions, whether they're private sector decisions or public sector decisions, mean to us. So these are the top 5 banks. And it's also interesting to note, just talking about consolidation of banks, that even approximately 30 years ago, there were about 40,000 commercial banks active in the United States. And right now there's around 5,000. So it's been a dramatic increase in bank consolidation. And that has a lot of impacts for our border region, not just with respect to the provision of banking and financial services, but particularly with economic development and economic stability. Because as our banking members here know, these anti-money laundering provisions can be very expensive to implement, especially when you're trying to know your customer, but your customer is 2,000 miles away. So the disappearance of community banks and more regionally situated banks in some ways has been not only detrimental to the economic stability of the border region, but also in the public safety, I would argue. Now, this is a snapshot of the main financial system regulators in the United States. And, you know, compared to other countries, including Mexico, as we'll see, banking regulation in the U.S. is highly fragmented at both the federal and the state levels. And since 1863, the U.S. has had what's known as a dual banking system. So you could be chartered at the federal level, or you could be chartered at the state level. And that kind of thing just doesn't exist in Mexico, as we saw earlier. So the primary regulators is the Federal Reserve System, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Office of Thrift Supervision. And the Federal Reserve's primary responsibility, as a central bank, as it was with the Banco de Mexico, was monetary policy, the amount of currency that's in circulation, and also ensuring that the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar remains strong and inflation is low. The central bank in the U.S. is independent from the federal government, though it's highly regulated in some ways not really regulated, but it's subject to congressional oversight. The president appoints the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and there's other things that the Federal Reserve has to do, like pay profits to the United States government after keeping some amount of a return, 6%. So the Federal Reserve System, which I'll show you in a second, is also composed of 12 different districts. And this is just going back to that first slide about how sort of divided and fractured our region is. And so it's not only divided and fractured between state governments and national governments, but even in terms of regulatory and law enforcement jurisdictions and fields of operation. So that will be something to look at. Now, the FDIC provides deposit insurance of up to $250,000 for the deposit holders, and it also supervises institution for safety and soundness. Now, most of the data that we get comes from the FDIC, and then most of the data that we get on the Mexican side comes from Comisión Nacional Bancaria de Valores and also the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público. And the comptroller of the currency charters and regulates national banks. That's sort of the system that allows a national bank to operate. The Office of Thrift Supervision was part of the Department of Treasury that chartered and regulated federal savings and loans, but it has since merged with the OCC. Now, this is a map. You guys, I should have been a cartographer, right? This is a map of the Federal Reserve System. And the boundaries for the Federal Reserve System were established back when it was created, early in the 1900s. And those boundaries were determined by population at that time. And we'll see throughout the presentation that population demographics are changing dramatically. They've changed our region dramatically, as we've seen. So sometimes you might ask yourself about the wisdom of maintaining these boundaries and if there should be something more, not efficient, but something that is just more natural with the way that things are developing across the United States. So what I want to point out is the 11th district and the 10th district and what you all can see about that. So in New Mexico, we have this joke about the tortilla curtain. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. This sort of separation between northern New Mexico and southern New Mexico. And, when I was at law school at UNM in Albuquerque, I couldn't get people to be interested in the border for love or money. I mean, it was just like pulling teeth. But this region is not only so fascinating and beautiful in its own right, but it's something that we really need to understand from not only a private sector point of view, but as you all know, from a public safety point of view. And in particular, all of us, and many of you might know about the current criminal activity that's really plaguing Bernalillo County and Albuquerque. So it really behooves us to understand the region more from a unitary perspective and less from a fractured perspective. So then the other interesting thing I wanted to mention about these districts is you'll see that Federal Reserve System has bank branches, and El Paso has a branch. And what the branches do is they essentially help the Federal Reserve bank in the central bank in the district with their operations. And in the 11th district, we have a branch here in El Paso, and that's the closest branch until you get to Denver. So Albuquerque doesn't have a branch. There's nothing really even close to that. So when we're talking about the distance and the physical distance and the time and the space between regulator and regulated, this starts to become very important. And not only that, but that the two districts cut through this region that, as we've been seeing, has a very geostrategic importance, not only for trade and commerce, but also for illegal activity. So at the state level, we have regulators as well, as I was mentioning earlier, and this is different from Mexico. In the Mexican legal system, power and authority and finance and financial power is highly concentrated. And it's not only highly concentrated in certain families or in certain groups, but in Mexico City in particular. So that's how you'll see as we go through this, that in many ways, the irony is that the Mexican system on paper is much more simple and it's much more straightforward. But in practicality, it might not always work as well as it does or well as it looks on paper. Whereas on the other hand, the United States has a very fractured system, whether this is with banking, whether it's with law enforcement, as we'll see in a second, or with energy. Everybody sort of has autonomy and jurisdiction in a way that Mexico does not. So the primary regulator in New Mexico for banking is the Financial Institutions Division of the Regulation and Licensing Department, located in Santa Fe, north of that curtain I was mentioning. And in Texas, it's the Texas Banking Department of Banking. And the Department of Banking is located very, 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 very far away in Austin, a whole nother time zone away. And again, that time and distance means a lot. Because the as we were saying earlier with like know your customers and knowing your region, the more time and space you put between yourself and the thing that you want to know about, that creates uncertainty, it creates miscommunication, and it creates opportunities, frankly, for criminal elements to leverage that uncertainty. So the Texas Department of Banking works under the supervision of the Texas Finance Commission. And this department charters, regulates, and examines banks and the financial system in Texas. And what it doesn't just charter and examine banks and trust corporations, but also money services businesses. And this is going to be important in a few minutes. Now, the other thing that the banks here, or the Texas Department of Banking does, is it looks to the health and the compliance of state and federal laws to the Texas banking system. Now, the MSBs that conduct currency exchange and transmission in Texas must be licensed. But licensees may appoint delegates that don't have to be licensed again. So once you apply as a money service business provider in Texas, you can then apply to have delegates work on your behalf. And those delegates don't have to then be retroactively licensed by the state of Texas. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like a very weak regulatory structure. Now, the Department of Banking ensures that the overall condition of MSBs is sound and that the MSB is properly maintaining, monitoring transactions to deter money laundering and other financial crimes. But as we'll see in a moment, when we get into the actual regulatory structures of MSBs in Texas and New Mexico, that might be harder than it sounds. So the New Mexico Financial Industries Divisions also licenses and regulates banks, trust companies, and money service businesses as well. And money service businesses are not just your check cashers, your payday lenders, your title lenders, but your money transmitters and even your currency exchangers. So what we also have done is, this is a slide of the banks in El Paso. And this can show you just at a glance, it's really like trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, working in El Paso, I think in whatever sector you're active in. And so not only do we see here, the names of the institutions that are here, but we see their bank class, the type of bank, whether they're a national member or a state member or a state non-member, as well as the primary regulator. And if you remember back to the slide with Juarez, there was one type and there was one regulator. And here we've got OCC, the Federal Reserve, we got FDIC. We just have sort of a plethora of agencies that govern these banks. On the other hand, we look at the not only market share of these banks in the region, but also the total deposits. And in Juarez, we calculated around $2 billion worth of deposits. And in El Paso, we were calculating around $8 billion worth of deposits. So that kind of information is important because once you're starting to think about the ways that markets are structured in the region, you start to understand the value propositions that exist not only for businesses, but also illicit organizations. So what's interesting also to note about El Paso is that the top 5 banks here account for roughly 80% of commercial bank market share, which is even higher than what we saw in Ciudad Juarez. These are Texas border counties compared with respect to deposits. And so it's also interesting to think not only how El Paso relates to other Texas border counties, but how their Mexican equivalents compare to those Texas border counties. So El Paso is lags really has for many years now behind Hidalgo County. And Hidalgo County, for all the geography buffs out there, is where McAllen is. So interesting to think why McAllen has around $10 billion worth of deposits on a yearly basis. And El Paso, which is in many ways a much more industrially active and commercially active region, has less deposits than McAllen. And then Webb County is Laredo. Why is El Paso County, with respect to deposits, close to or on par with Webb County, with such a small community out there in Laredo? So we don't have all the answers, but we think we are getting good at knowing what questions to ask. These are the Doña Ana County banking institutions. And what you'll see here again, so what we've done is we create these common frames of reference across jurisdictions and across sectors. And again, it's kind of like the Tower of Babel. It's Humpty Dumpty with respect to the regulators and the types of banks. And then with respect to total deposits, we have here around $2 billion, which is significantly lower than El Paso. And with respect to market share, there's less of a concentration in Las Cruces than there is in El Paso or Ciudad Juarez. Now, with respect to border counties and real deposits, looking across the New Mexico border counties there, I mean, in relative terms, Doña Ana counties like New York City compared to Hidalgo and Luna County. But nevertheless, it's also important to monitor these activities and deposits in these rural counties, because that's where these kinds of criminal organizations are able to take advantage of weak institutions. They're able to take advantage of lack of knowledge or lack of resources. So not only, we don't just focus on El Paso and Doña Ana County, but we focus on the outlying communities as well in order to get a good sense of what's happening. So this is just a graph to show how deposits have been growing in the region. And what we'll look at later in the presentation is the degree to which real deposits are correlated with violence or are correlated with criminal activity. So it's not just important to understand how the banking and the financial structure is developing across the region, but how that intersects or coincides with major criminal activity in the region. And what we can see here is that El Paso has been on a pretty steady uptick since 2000. And in Doña Ana County, at a much lower baseline of deposits, it's kind of been, lurching a little bit back and forth, but not anything as significantly upward as El Paso. This is total deposits in billions, and it's just to show, again, to tie it all together, how El Paso County dominates both Doña Ana County and Ciudad Juarez. So where's all this money coming from? Something that's also important to remember as we go through this presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is the structure of the markets and the way that the economic activity is regulated, the way it's been done, it's the customs and the practices around these communities for the last several hundred years. And what we see in El Paso, Las Cruces, and Ciudad Juarez is a great divergence in terms of the type of economic activity taking place. Las Cruces in Doña Ana County is very rural. It's amazing. You just sort of go north past Binton and you're in the pecan fields. And then if you go south through downtown, you're in sort of an industrial powerhouse in northern Mexico. And then you're here in El Paso and you see all the logistics and the warehousing and the support services for that activity. So we have a very kind of fractured and divergent economic structure here. And we can see that here in the structure of employment. So if you look at El Paso, Texas, Las Cruces, and Ciudad Juarez, only one of them really has a significant industrial base or manufacturing employment, and that's Juarez. But at the same time, remembering the amount of deposits that we saw, these manufacturing jobs are not like your Flint, Michigan, or Detroit or Chicago manufacturing jobs. These are low-paying jobs that don't really go back into the financial sector in Ciudad Juarez. And that's important because the financial system in Ciudad Juarez, relative to the size of the city's bigger than El Paso. The city's bigger than El Paso. The city has more foreign direct investment than El Paso. But the financial system is considerably weaker than El Paso's. And that is not just important from an economic development point of view. It's not just important from a community well-being point of view. It's important from a law enforcement and a national security point of view. Because if the financial system is weak and if people are not participating in that financial system, who are they? What are they doing? What methods or avenues are they using to get money or get financing if they're not in the traditional institutions? The other thing to remember about the structure of the Juarez economy that is pretty important is that a lot of times these large manufacturers do not participate in the financial system in Juarez. The capital that is used to build these factories comes from New York or London or some other foreign city. And the kind of financing that factory needs, they get also from external sources. If you think about New Jersey, if you think about the Ohio River Valley, if you think about any kind of traditional industrial area, the banks and the industries grew together. What we have in Juarez is kind of a paradox where you have a lot of industrial activity, but the industrial jobs are not feeding back into the financial system, and the industrial actors themselves are not participating in that financial system as they traditionally have done with industrial operations in history. Now, this is some graphs to discuss informal and formal employment in Ciudad Juarez. So formal and informal employment really follows from what I was kind of just describing. And if employees are informal, they're not participating, first of all, in the Social Security framework in Mexico. So they don't have the same degree of access to services, Social Security, medicine and medical coverage as others do, but therefore they're more vulnerable. But they also don't pay taxes. They're not taxed, and so their money doesn't go into the general fisc of the city or the federal or state governments. So this then creates more weakness institutionally for the state of Chihuahua, the city of Juarez, and for Mexico. The other thing that we see here is that formal and informal employment formal employment rises in Juarez in the good times, but then it also kind of falls in Juarez very quickly when there are shocks to the U.S. system, because the whole maquila industry in Juarez is feeding, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. market. So the spike in violence that we saw in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10 coincided with the financial crisis in the United States and the great amount of unemployment, deportations. So we had all this turmoil here economically that resulted in a lot of bloodshed and a lot of pain for our community. So again, I just really want to emphasize this linkage between economic vitality and public safety and national security. So currently, almost 25% of those employed in Ciudad Juarez are informal. And overall, now the interesting thing about Juarez is that the Juarez in relative terms, I mean, think about El Paso, think if 25% of all employees in El Paso were not employed formally. They weren't paying taxes. They weren't, registered with Social Security. What would that mean for our economy? But this is the case in Juarez. Now, the interesting thing about Juarez, though, in relative terms in Mexico, it's doing really well. The overall informal rate in Mexico is around 60%. So it's also important to remember when we're thinking about Mexico that Mexico doesn't begin or end in Juarez. A lot of the forces that we're talking about with drug trafficking, with drug financing, extend all the way out to the Pacific, to the Gulf Coast, to Central America, to the Andes, and even to Asia, Africa, and Europe. So Juarez is really, in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, the forward operating base of a lot of these activities, whether they're legal or whether they're totally legitimate private sector activities like the maquilas and the industrial operations. But if Mexico is overall a very informal economy, then that creates risks that we need to know about as law enforcement, as regulators, as private sector actors. Now, Chihuahua and Nuevo León, where Monterrey is, very, very great city. Maida's from Monterrey, so I always have to recognize what a wonderful city that is. They have some of the lowest informal employments at the state level, and around 40% and 39% respectively. So these northern border states and northern border cities have higher formal employment, but a lot of that employment is in the maquila, which, as we mentioned earlier, doesn't really pay that well and doesn't cycle back into the financial system. So the other issue with the structure of the Mexican banking system and financial system isn't just the informality. It's also the access to banking infrastructure, to bank branches, to ATMs. And this has been a long-standing problem in Mexico. The number of commercial branches in Mexico has been increasing somewhat in recent years. This is a graph between 2008 and 2014. And as we see here, the same usual suspects are always there, those same banks. Now, of the major banks, except for Azteca there to your far left, Ban Norte, Santander, and Bancopo have seen little significant growth. Now, the interesting thing about Banco Azteca is that it has become a commercial bank, but it was originally like a rent-a-center. Banco Azteca and Bancopo are places where you get consumer loans for the purchase of consumer goods on the spot. So that was a huge magnet for like an underserved area in Mexico. And it's not a coincidence that in New Mexico and El Paso, Texas, we also deal a lot with these purchase money security interest institutions and entities. And we share a lot of similarities also with Juarez with respect to the money services businesses as well. So most states in Mexico saw an increase in commercial bank branches between 2008 and 2014. But if you look there sort of, 1/3 to the right, you see Chihuahua. And Chihuahua saw very little growth in those 6 years. And Chihuahua there still lags behind Tamaulipas, whereas Reynosa, and it lags behind even Michoacán. It lags behind Puebla. It lags behind Guerrero even. Guerrero. I mean, I don't know of a much more rural state in Mexico than Guerrero, ¿verdad, Mayra? Así es. So it's interesting. We also, what we do a lot of times at the Hunt Institute is not just present absolute data or raw data, but we also try to put it in relative terms so that we get an understanding of where our states are, where our region is situated relative to others. So if Chihuahua is such an economic powerhouse and we have a city of 2.5 million people here just to the south of us, and then we have the capital of Chihuahua, why are commercial banks not growing, and why are they lagging behind other states that have even less economic and commercial activity? Now, this is a per capita graph of Chihuahua in relative terms, where it is to other states. So on a per capita basis, Chihuahua is there at around 15 bank branches in the state for every 100,000 individuals. And again, look at what's to the left of Chihuahua: Campeche, Coahuila, another border state, Tamaulipas, Quintana Roo, Colima, Guerrero, much smaller states. Now, Guerrero is a very interesting actor because there's really no industrial activity in that state to speak of. It's highly agricultural. There's a lot of drug trafficking that goes through Guerrero. It's a Pacific state. You have Acapulco, and you have, which is an old port, and a lot of violence associated with drug trafficking there. Now, with respect to municipalities, this is a graph of municipalities with more than 100 bank branches. And towards the middle of the graph, you see, oops, is that a touchscreen? Wow, look at that. Okay, so here you see in the middle of this graph is Juarez and Chihuahua. Again, lagging behind other cities that are smaller and seemingly less economically active than Juarez, like León, very strong city, but not as big as Juarez. And then even some delegations within Mexico City. Now, this is number of commercial ATMs in Mexico. And I have to tell you that the Mexican government apparently is quite concerned about this and has been implementing a lot of policies, at least with this current administration, to increase banking involvement and what is called inclusión financiera. Because from a central bank point of view and from the point of view of the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público, the more people that participate in a banking system, the stronger the economy is. The stronger the banking system is, the more it can lend, the more it can profit, and then the more it can lend in turn. So there's this great push to do that. And in some ways, the banking infrastructure has been growing after those kinds of policies have been implemented, as we see here. But there's still a long way to go. Now, this is number of ATMs in Mexico by commercial bank. And then here we have number of ATMs in Mexico by state. And as we see here again, Chihuahua lags behind Coahuila, it lags behind Tamaulipas, which are border states that are important, but maybe not as industrially active or economically active as Chihuahua is, with both the maquila operations in the capital and here in Ciudad Juarez. So percentage of ATMs by Mexican state, this is Chihuahua as a state has 4% of all ATMs in Mexico. And so what does that mean for inclusión financiera, and what does that mean for the health and vitality of the financial sector? But this also is something very important as we start getting into the anti-money laundering aspect and the law enforcement aspect. The fewer people that are participating in a formal banking system, it's harder to trace and track and understand who these people are, where the money's coming from, and how it's being used. So not only is this a question of economic stability and economic security, but it's also one of regional and national security. Commercial bank branches in Mexico border cities. Now, seemingly they're all relatively similar, except for Nuevo Laredo, which is interesting. Because we saw that that city has a lot of activity, especially with respect to Laredo on the other side. But Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua look to be on par with Tijuana. Commercial bank ATMs as well. They seem to be relatively similar, and Nuevo Laredo is quite an outlier. So again, that's not just like to look at Nuevo Laredo and say, "Oh, poor guys, where are you going to find an ATM on a Saturday night?" But to really understand sort of the structure and the formality of the banking system in that border city and what that means for Texas, what it means for the U.S.-Mexico national security enterprise. What we've also done, and this is, again, sort of where we try to really provide value, is identify at a very local level what's going on with respect to bank branches and ATMs in Ciudad Juarez. Like I said earlier, living here in New Mexico and living here in the border, we see these maps, in the newspaper or on the television of the weather. And then, if you look south of the U.S.-Mexico border, it's all gray. And you think that they don't have weather in Mexico. And that is not only true with weather, but it's true with banking, it's true with national security, it's true with criminal information sharing. And so what we're trying to do as an institute is provide you all, whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in the consular sector, whether you're in law enforcement, with as detailed and granular an understanding of what's happening in our region simultaneously and with a common frame of reference. So that's why we always try to put everything in perspective, not only regionally, but also with the same kind of methods and the same kind of data structures. So these are ATMs and branches and quadras with the numbers of bank branches and the number of ATMs and the total. So we can start getting understandings of per capita inclusion and what that means. So this then marks the transition from a discussion of the sort of informality of the Mexican system and the structure of the economics activity in El Paso, Doñana County, and Ciudad Juarez, to a discussion of alternative financial services and what people are using in the market to get access to capital, access to money, if they're not participating. And in this section, we'll also discuss the way that those alternative financial services, those money services businesses, are regulated by the Texas government, the New Mexico government, and the Mexican government. And what we'll see is we'll see a great divergence in the way that payday lending, title loans are managed by these governments, as well as money transmitters and what's happening there as well. And then also, as we move into the discussion of the regulatory structure and the data around these and the characteristics of these activities in the region, we'll start trying to understand how they're used for nefarious or impermissible purposes. So this is some information that we gathered with respect to Las Cruces money services businesses. Now, look there. There's some of the weirdest names I've ever seen for the companies. I don't know, who comes up with that stuff. But if you look at the headquarters, you'll see that a lot of that is, again, businesses from foreign jurisdictions. So a lot of these people who are engaging in money services businesses in our region are not really located in our region. And this is a perennial issue for a lot of our important subject matters in the El Paso, Juarez, Doñana County corridor. And what you'll also notice there, that there's a lot of agents in Las Cruces for these money services businesses. The other thing I want to mention about money services businesses and data is we have this joke. You guys might think I'm the most humorless person in the world, but it's not true. And that is, we call it green light, yellow light, red light. And you'll see this as we move into more money laundering data and other financial characteristics. Is Texas, you get everything. In the US, you get a lot of data very easily, and it's very easy to clean up and put into an Excel sheet. And if you go to New Mexico, that's your yellow light. I mean, they've maybe got the data. They can send it to you, but it's going to cost $200 and check or money order and this kind of thing. And then when you go to the Mexican side, it's really hard to get data. So we're going to see here like a lot of divergences with what we can get access to and what we can't get access to. But what we try to do no matter what as an institute is provide this common frame of reference. So then we also have El Paso money services businesses by type. And there's quite a bit in El Paso. There's almost twice as many. Now, the only thing I want to say before we take a quick break here is that generally, green light, yellow light, red light prevails with respect to data analysis or data acquisition and analysis. But there's great divergences in the way that Texas regulates money services businesses than New Mexico does. Texas has a much more laissez-faire, unregulated approach to check cashing, to small loan companies, as they're called, to money transmitters than does New Mexico. So interestingly enough, in this case, with respect to money services businesses, New Mexico is the green light, Texas is the yellow light, and Juarez is still kind of like difficult to get data. So I just wanted to share that with you before the break, and then we'll get into some discussion of payday title loans, money remittances, a lot of graphs showing where that money is going in Chihuahua, where it's coming from, as well as data on suspicious activities, the structures of the anti-money laundering enterprises in the U.S. level, Mexico, as well as at the state level in Texas and New Mexico. So I'm free and here available to talk to you, as is Maida and Jose Angel, and thank you so much.